Well, I think we'll get started and let people trickle in as they trickle in. But basically, how this is going to work, as you all know, as inter-intellect veterans, first I'll ask Diane to give us a brief reading of one of the passages from her book. And then I've got some questions for her. We'll be back and forth around 45 minutes or so, and then turn it over to you guys and have a collaborative discussion, and then probably wrap around 6:20 or 6:25, just because I have a final ferry to catch, and I can't miss it. But without further ado, Diane, over to you if you want to tell us a little bit about Happiness Far and then what you're reading from today.
Okay, so my book, my debut essay collection is called Happier Far. It's not a giant book. It's not an overloaded, it doesn't overload you with too much. It's sort of a book about becoming. It's a book that starts off in Frankfurt, Germany, where I was born on the day of my birth. I try to figure out what the day of my birth was like, but it's really about a search for my parents. And it begins with a search for who I am, and it continues with goes through immigrating to being in India, immigrating to America, getting older, racism, chronic pain, divorce, figuring out who I am, what it means to have a kind of two-part existence, which I think we all really understand. Increasingly, it was much different back then in the early 70s, or there weren't a lot of Asians in America. And then the work of becoming is really about becoming a writer and becoming a human being and a mother, and trying to understand what it means in terms of the decisions I make. And in large part, that means being relentless, I think, and being relentless about what you want as a writer, what kind of person you are, how you live your life. And so that's sort of a summary, if you will. And a lot of the book is about family and about probably more my mother than my father, but they had a weird marriage. She's an American Jew from Ashkenazi Jew from Brooklyn, and my father is an Indian Jain from North India, from a town name or a city named Rajkot, a town of 200,000 people. And my parents were in Bombay. I was in Bombay for 7 years. And, there's a mixed East-West thing, which everyone thinks is really nice, but it isn't. And it doesn't work so easily in a marriage. She was an intellectual. He was a researcher and a physician. And so she died when I was 35. And this piece that I'm going to read, her greatest hits, is about her and trying to understand her. So she was really pathologically depressed since India and most of her life. So she kind of checked out. And being an immigrant in America in the 70s was not so much fun with a checked out mother and a very Indian absent father. So, and here, as I've gotten older, I've tried to figure out who is she, who am I compared to them or connected to them. And at some point I went on a date with my boyfriend, and we saw something at Carnegie Hall with a series of performances, including Beethoven. And it was a Beethoven sonata, and I've never liked Beethoven. And this is what this essay, Her Greatest Hits, is about, because my mother loved Beethoven. So I began a deep dive, and I learned something about myself and about her. It's about 6 minutes, just so you don't freak out. Then going to go on for too long. I started listening to Beethoven's piano sonatas, occasioned by a date with my partner at Carnegie Hall. I never liked Beethoven. I dismissed his music as bombastic and thunderous. His symphonies refused to become background music and enraged me for being violently unpredictable, and they reminded me in personality of my mother. She loved Beethoven, and I never understood why. This set me on a course of listening to the sonatas for the next few months. One evening, I listened to a gramophone podcast with the pianist Jonathan Biss, who was discussing his experience recording all 32 of Beethoven's sonatas. When they took up Opus 111, Sonata number 32, the final sonata, the interviewer said quietly, "You must realize there are people in the audience who are hearing that sonata for the first time. Maybe it is only when you don't know what you are listening for that you find what you were waiting all along to discover. I put on my headphones to listen to Sonata number 32 for the first time. I had chosen Beethoven accidentally and not at all accidentally. Well, I cannot tell you much about Sonata number 32 itself. I can tell you that 4 minutes into the second movement, he starts swinging, as if I were listening to Scott Joplin. But this is 100 years before ragtime exists. Suddenly, I'm dumbstruck and lost inside it, wondering what the hell he's doing. Beethoven had been deaf for years by then. He put the sonata in the world using sounds he had memorized over years and whose tones he understood. He was deaf, but he heard them in his mind. We spend our whole lives learning that we already have everything we need to survive. We hope we have gambled on the right life with the right people. We rack up failure and disappointment. We are never good enough. Beethoven didn't do this. He worked tirelessly and revised his work to get themes right. Even the simplest notes crush expectation. Now, I'm a good 6 or 7 minutes into the second movement of Sonata number 32, and he levels those chords up, orchestral, colliding, and renegotiating time and some kind of harmony before narrowing again into a lyric. What I hear when Beethoven races along the edge of what seems possible in music is the music that I played for so many years on my piano, serviceably but enjoyably. I hear the sound of my own weeping in shock at what he accomplished and at having missed the chance to listen to him all these years. I hear at age 53, for the first time, genius. I hear all the doubt in the world and none of the doubt in the world. What we want Beethoven to tell us is that our lives are meaningful, even when our relationships are not, that our conversations yield joy, discovery, kindness, that our parents love us dearly, that the conversation is not one-sided, that there is more to discover beyond love. I don't believe it. It's not accurate to say that we are lost and uncomfortable much of the time. The rest of the world, or your children, may think your life is ugly, that you have not accomplished much, that you are ordinary, that you missed your opportunities, that what you've read and how misses the point. Too bad your greatest hits moments of life, according to the consensus, didn't create nobility or compassion in you or make you famous. Too bad. Too bad you didn't do enough. You're an emotional shambles. What I hear in the chords of my mother's life, now that I have listened to Sonata number 32 hundreds of times, is that in her forever sadness was a life not fully lived. But is this true? I know my mother was not as whole as she would have liked, but her desire was not empty. Those sonatas must have filled some of it. She had undeniably intimate moments with music when love did not come crashing down the way it did in her marriage. I am listening to 32 sonatas in which love does not come crashing down. I have gone more than 2 decades without hearing her voice.
Thank you so much. That was, it was beautiful to read it, but it's even more beautiful to hear it read aloud and kind of hear the music of it that way. So I do want to come back to this essay, but I want to start us off somewhere else, and that is this incredibly evocative section you have. I believe it's in the second essay about the sort of the Asian grocery in an American town. And this idea that there's a kind of sort of pan-otherness that takes place as different immigrant groups from different Asian immigrant communities kind of come through and pass through this place to buy coriander in particular, which is as you put up in the essay, is not there are not yet green markets at this time. And I'm curious about your exploration of that feeling of otherness or not quite belonging or not quite fitting in as someone who is sort of weaving together different strands of cultural identity. And that's very much the focus of the first two essays in the book and also sort of the book more broadly. And so I sort of wonder if you could start us off by talking about the relationship between kind of liminality and otherness and belonging for you as a writer, and in this book particularly.
It's much stronger in this book, I have to say. I'm also a poet, and in my second book of poems, I avoid, and I've been thinking about this idea of Asianness, and someone asked me to be on a panel about being Asian, and I thought, what does that mean, being Asian? There's quite a lot of us, and what do we have in common? And so this grocery, there was, right now New Jersey is filled with Indian groceries, and then a big Indian population. But back in 1973, there were very few of us, and there was this one grocery. And so you'd go and you'd see the Japanese and the Chinese and the Filipino. Who knows what anybody was? Nobody knew who any of us was. And we'd have our own special aisles, and nobody would go in that aisle except once in a while. You'd crawl in and you'd look at these things, and they were a different color, and people would kind of give you a look. But in the front, in bunches, there was always coriander, fresh coriander, which you can't really get in stores. And it was terrible. And even now, coriander is much better at the Indian markets. And so you'd have this little beautiful moment of being back in your own country. And maybe in this way, all Asian countries are kind of alike. And then you go back to your suburbs, because New Jersey was a giant suburb, and we were all there sponsoring the next family and the next family and the next. And so you have yourself and your cousins, and then your next cousins and your next cousins, and you'd all go to the same grocery store. And then it was this kind of very marginalized existence that everybody was living, is that we didn't know each other at all. And in this book, I really try to dig into not, I am other, I am Asian, as much as what does it mean to live this kind of, like, who actually am I? Like, if I have this father who's Jain, and Jainism is a minority religion in India. There's only, I don't know, there's so many people in India, so I can't say there's only a few million. There might be like hundreds of millions of Jains. It was maybe 2% of the population, and Hindus would be 75%, Muslims about 25%, and Jains or Jews and Parsis might be 1 or 2% tops. So, if I was born in Germany and was going to be an American citizen because my mother was American, yet I didn't come to America until I was 7, and I grew up and had an immigrant experience and lived in India, what kind of life, I'm an immigrant, but I'm also American. I am Jewish, but I don't practice. I am Jain, but I don't practice. And in India, you get to practice all the secular holidays. Everybody's celebrating everything. It's fun. You throw powder at each other, and there are big effigies of everything, and it's lots of fun. So the things that we associate, like you were talking about liminality and this idea of Asianness and exploring it in the book, they're often tropes that we come to. And in poetry, I think in my first book, I tried to do this with you mentioned cumin and sarongs and this and that, you have a very impressionistic experience of what it means. And here I'm trying to go deeper into it. So what more can I do except go into the actual day of my birth and wonder what it was really like? Like, the big question is, did my parents love me? And Asian families are very, they're dutiful. Do they love? I don't know. Do the Asian men love? Do Indian men love? Not the way the wives and the mothers and the aunties do. They take care of you. You take care of your cousins, and you're there for life. I mean, it is a deeply, India anyway, and I think many other Asian countries seem to be like this, the deeply loyal place. So yet my parents were extremely unhappy together because, an intellectual Jew from Brooklyn who's a very psychological and depressed doesn't really pair up with an Indian Jain, quiet, unemotional physician so easily. So I keep exploring, and what I keep trying to get across in the book is that I keep exploring, and I'm not really coming up with anything. And I'm actually coming up with a lot, but I'm not coming up with the answer. Just like I want to know what that day of my birth was like, but they didn't let my dad in the room. And so my mother was on her own. And since she's dead, I have no information about that day. And I would like to know if she loved me, if she picked me up, or, all these ridiculous things that you can't actually come to. but it becomes less about the family and who I am as, in terms of figuring out my identity, because I don't need to figure out my identity anymore. I've already, I am an immigrant. I am this person who experienced a lot of racism, and it burned me, and it hurt me, and I was the one called out in all the groups, with horrible names, and it was pretty brutal until about I became 17 or 18 and moved away. So the real question is not just what do those mean, because maybe we all experience it in different ways or at different times. I know some people who grew up in very homogenous communities, or friends who are Black, who said they didn't get any racism until they got to college, and I'm like, my goodness, lucky you. Um, it's like that, it depends on where you are. And so I moved into a town that had, I think, one Japanese family, one Chinese family, a couple of Jewish families, no Indians, and otherwise a very white Catholic town. And so really people hadn't, seen people with accents or come across them. And so that, of course, affected me. But then what does it mean to be an artist and get beyond that? Do I want to write about that in these essays? Yes, but I also want to discover who I actually am, rather than who people saw me as. And that's not really an answer, because I'm still becoming someone.
Well, this leads us sort of very neatly into my next question, which is the balancing of kind of the exploration of who you really are with this kind of wider societal portrait of what it means to be in history. Like I'm struck, I mean, in your first essay, you talk about, I believe, between May 12th and July 18th, 1966. So between, if I'm right, your birth, oh, happy birthday, your
Thank
birthday.
you.
And when your birth is kind of registered with the sort of as an American born
Yeah.
abroad, and these sort of two hypothetical birth dates, and you take us on a little sort of historical tour of what's going on at that time in this 5-week period. Betty Friedan founds the National Organization for Women, for example, and I'm curious how you think about in writing memoir where the focus is on you as a person, you as an individual, on your family and your community, and then on these kind of this wider historical story. How do you approach braiding those together?
I think for the most part, if I could, if if there's one way that I would like to see it, is that I would be invisible. That's actually a title of one of the essays, Invisible Woman, because I was so invisible to people in a way. But I would like to be the invisible person telling the story that we all understand. And of course, I am invisible, because my story is not more important than your story, anybody else's story, but it also has it offers other people who grew up in these environments a sense of how to ask some questions, and how to figure out, what's around the corner, what's next, what does it actually mean? And you don't have to ask all the same questions. It doesn't have to be like, I decide that I'm an Indian American person with this, and how do I self-identify? Um, More interesting than that is if you keep panning out, and I think it takes getting a little older, because I probably wouldn't have done this 20 years ago. um, the more I pan out, the bigger the world is, and the smaller I am, which makes me happier, because it's not that I want to be small, but it's just that it puts my life in the context of all the other things that were happening, and I get to learn. So in the actual essay, I get to research, I get to discover something. So I did not know in those 3 months between when I was born and when they registered me with the German government or the American embassy in Germany, um, that, I think it was Homi Bhabha was killed, or assassinated by the CIA. I hope I'm getting these dates right. And now had started. I tried to address Vietnam, but of course, that spans decades. But and it's a way of trying to figure out how to explain that these things were going on in life, and recognize that you were just one moment in that life, yet your life is profoundly important to you and to the people around you, and that everybody has the same sort of story. Everyone has a different approach. And I'm not sure if I answered your question exactly, but maybe there's another part. Oh, the historical context. The racism, I think, is the one thing that I really want people to to hear, because it was so brutal, and stark and striking that sometimes it almost seems unbelievable. Like I have this one line, which I don't know if I'm allowed to say the N-word on here, but I think I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to list all the names that people call me, which was Jungle Bunny, Spear Chucker, Kike, and Nigger, and those were my names. And so, my son yells at me when I say some of these words, and he says, you can't say that. I'm like, well, this is what everybody called me for like 15 years. And what am I, so I'm explaining what happened to me and how people saw me. So I kept thinking, well, what is the organization? So I'm interested in lists. And I thought, well, what is the organization of these words, and how do and one thing I want to do in my book constantly is interrogate. So I'm interrogating myself, I'm interrogating my parents, I'm interrogating the day of my birth. What really happened on the day of my birth? If my mother had been there and said, all these things happened, would they have really been true, or is her memory a little off? So I thought, okay, let me just make it up. It doesn't matter. And there's a difference between memory and reality, but we don't really know what that is. So I try to figure out, well, let me see if I can engage with the reader here. So if you get to this one word, maybe I started with Jungle Bunny and I put it first, and you think, okay, not so bad, and you kind of go, and then you get to Spear Chucker, and you're like, not so good as a reader, and you think, oh, I shouldn't have laughed at that. And then, this is where I was sort of hoping and setting readers up. And then Kike, you think, oh, the Holocaust. Oh, this is not good. And then Nigger, or I might have put Nigger first and then Kike. I can't remember. I think I put slavery at the end, and I thought, okay, that whole point is to interrogate myself, to let the reader sort of gently be interrogated and realize that this is the way that I had to also figure out who I am. So I had to figure out, am I Black? Am I white? Am I these things? And my aunt and my mother would answer in peculiar ways. So if I said, am I closer to Black, when someone threw stones at me and called me names, I said, well, am I this thing? And am I Black or white? And she said neither. And I said, well, am I closer to Black or white? And she said white. And I was very fast answer. And I thought, why did she say that? All these years, I'm still thinking about that. So, there's part of that, that history is how kids grew up in the 70s, when there weren't a lot of Asians, and even now in this era, when people, you hear about someone who is attacked or murdered, and it's because people, all these things are terrible, but it's because someone thought a Punjabi was an Arab, or a Pakistani was this, or, nobody understands the variety of identities and what they mean. And we all have our little thing going in South Asia, for example. And yet there's no way to tell the fullest story. And this is maybe true of Asian Americans too. So as I struggle to fit into all these, like the Jewish American thing or the Asian American thing, it's really publicity. But what does that mean to me? Do I practice? Do I believe in God? Does my dad believe in God? Does that make him not Jain because he doesn't? It turns out he has been reciting this one prayer his whole life. And I thought, my God, so this prayer from this first Jain prayer that you learn as a child, he's still chanting. And I was shocked and touched to hear that. And then at some point he said, oh, it's just because it's boring and it helps me fall asleep. So I was like, okay.
So actually, the essay on chanting is actually where I wanted to go next, and I wanted to ask you about something, a particular line in that essay that really interested me, and kind of its relationship to the act of writing, which is you write, desire is the only place where suffering does not exist for me, and you have this meditation, particularly on Jane chanting and the ideas of certain kinds of practices that might release us, or we sort of hope will release us from certain cycles of desire or suffering. And yet I'm curious, as a writer, as someone who for whom perhaps desire and suffering are the, at least as speaking for me as a writer, like those are my raw material, that's my clay that I work with. Kind of how do you approach both desire and suffering as something, as things that are, and I think it's interesting that you describe desire as the place where suffering does not exist. I think often suffering and desire are sort of have historically been sort of theologically linked. How do you see them together as informing your practice as a writer?
If I'm to believe that in desire, suffering does not exist, or just in general?
In general, sort of where's your own perspective on it?
Hmm. It's interesting because in chanting, you're supposed to empty your mind, and then eventually, as you keep chanting in Jain chanting, your mind starts filling up with questions. So as you lead, and I don't know if it's like this in Buddhism or in deep chanting in other um, religions, that your mind starts filling up with more questions. You get to higher levels of understanding with God or with yourself. So I just wrote down desire and suffering. Desire and suffering do not exist. Wouldn't it be great if one of those didn't exist? Probably suffering. So I don't know. The desire, I feel like you're always chasing something, and you're chasing also the absence of suffering. But the more you go into whatever you're doing, you have to be more vulnerable. Otherwise, your work isn't working as well. It can never work as well if you're not going to be vulnerable as a writer, which means you have to suffer more. And so I feel that it's a little bit of a loop. And so also, when you really are suffering, the desire that comes through the writing, I mean, the forward motion, the propulsion, the feeling of wanting to live, wanting to exist, of wanting to create something that sustains you and that uplifts you. And I don't, and yes, it's sort of a self-helpy thing, but I don't mean it in a self-helpy way. It's just that that is your resource. That is what you do. And so it is the closest thing to you, and you're no longer alone with it. Like, so you're no longer alone with yourself. You have, your own skills, which include your own desire to be better, to write something that's more meaningful, to twist a word, to get out of something by manipulating something as small as a sonnet or as small as a sentence, and that does remove some of the suffering, because if you can do that, you've released yourself from the world a little bit. Suddenly the screen got really big.
I think the interintellect host Zoom just went in and out. So I want to return us back to what you read in her greatest hits. And I think maybe that was one of, I mean, I had many favorites, but this was particularly one of them. And what interested me most was this kind of the way that you are able to use the experience, like the ex an asynchronous experience of the same thing to explore the kind of asymptotic limit of how well we can know another person, is listening to something that someone we love listened to, is and particularly keeping track of the books your mother read at particular periods in her life, which is just such a fascinating artifact. How how did you approach the writing of this particular essay? Did you kind of know when you were starting to do that kind of mirroring or research that this is where it would end up? Did it come as a surprise to you? Did you know this is something you were going to write about when you were when you began, or was it something where, the essay came later?
I never know where an essay begins, and it's like I'm sort of in that space right now where I feel like, I mean, maybe it's not the best comparison. Like I feel like I want to throw up, but you're not throwing up yet, and so you feel something building, and you're like, no, that's not it. No, that's not it. And until it sort of breaks loose and you can't stop, and then you start writing. It actually starts with going to the Philharmonic. So I wanted to tell a story, or I thought I wanted to tell a story about going to the Philharmonic when we lived in New Jersey. And my mother was a big fan of classical music. So we went, and she taught us how to think critically. So the only reason, and much of the reason that I'm a writer, is because she would have been a writer if she hadn't been so depressed. And this is her mind I inherited. And when we'd go to the Philharmonic, she'd ask me to identify the sounds and the musicians, and she'd go into another la la land, and she was happy for the first time. And she was so it started with a very beat by beat child's view of going to the Philharmonic, watching her happiness. It was almost too embarrassing to see watching my father fall asleep and coming back to New Jersey and feeling that the place was alive, and then getting into my pajamas with these Lance of Salzburg beautiful nightgowns that women used to have back then, or girls used to have. They're very fluffy, soft flannel things that you guys probably wouldn't know about, but but it was about
I
this.
tried to visualize it. I'd never come
They're
across one.
very old fashioned. You can still get them at the Vermont country store. But what I was interested in is I at the time had been reading Anthony Tomasini. Let me just check the name. So I was reading uh Anthony Tomasini's book, Indispensable. I was learning about classical music, the indispensable composers, a personal guide. And then he starts talking about why he wrote this book, and that some people, when he started doing some experiments about who are the greatest composers, people would get upset, people would get involved. And then he talked about his previous his predecessor, a music critic at the New York Times, Harold Schoenberg. Let me make sure I got that right. And who wrote a book called The Lives of the Great Composers. And in this book of books that she has, where she lists all the books she read, in 1980, she read Harold Schoenberg's The Lives of the Great Composers. And I happened to flip to that page when I was reading Tomasini, and Tomasini had mentioned Schoenberg, and I thought, that's weird. And so I started looking at what she was reading right at that time, which was Wagner by Panofsky, Wagner by Taylor, on Wagner by Gutmann, Beethoven, a pictorial biography. She liked these pictorial biographies. I don't know if they still exist. Something about the Metropolitan Opera, an Electra libretto, A Portrait of a Marriage by Vita Sackville West and Harold Nicholson, The Adulterous Women by Camus. So I realized that what she wanted, what her desire was, that she wanted, I think, sex. And so I was young at this time. I also wanted sex. I was a teenager, and so meanwhile, I'm reading Tomasini and she's reading Schoenberg. And as I'm reading Tomasini talk about this and see what she's reading and start listening to the sonatas, and after I'm thinking about how Tomasini talks about Beethoven, and Schoenberg also must have talked about him in a particular way. And there were certain links I realized that she can't have gone. Once I discovered that the sonatas exist, I thought, well, she obviously must have listened to the sonatas. And if you're going to listen to the sonatas, you would listen to all 32. There's not that many. And when I got to Sonata 32, and it broke my heart, and I started weeping, and I just was like an animal, like thinking, I've never heard anything like this, and I've never had this kind of experience. I'm putting these two things in parallel, and then realize she also must have listened to this. And so she can't have lived as awful a life as I gave her in my mind. So, and we think these things of, our parents. And sometimes my son says, sort of talks to me in a certain way that he clearly doesn't admire everything I do. And and I think, what do you know? You're 21 years old, and what did I know? So what I want to keep doing in this book is interrogating the day of my birth, my parents, who I am. How dare I? That's what this essay really says. How dare I have assumed these things about her to be true? Because clearly, she was in love with the sound of Beethoven. How could you not be? Nobody could hear this and not feel heartbroken. And she felt the same way about painting and opera, and there were all these things she could have done. So she had this deep inner life despite her depression, and she wanted to talk to paintings and to Beethoven, maybe not to me, but she had more than I understood. And so when she died when I was 35, she knows very little about me. So this was a way of kind of having a conversation and kind of chiding myself for making assumptions about her, which I think are probably true, but I'm still maybe I make one too many.
So I've got a couple more questions for you, but I do want to kind of give Ben and Dan a heads up that after that we'll be moving to the sort of audience discussion part of the chat. So I will say, invite you now, if you do have questions that come up over the next 10, 15 minutes, please feel free to leave them in the chat. That also helps me know where the conversation's going to go. And then you're also very welcome to ask questions, or answer them with your voices and faces as well. But I've got a few more now, and about 5:50, 5:55 we'll transition to a wider discussion. And I want to next ask you about structure, both in Year of the Dog and Married with Turtle. And particularly in Year of the Dog, you do something kind of really structurally interesting, and it's sort of you structure Year of the Dog as this kind of letter to like the world's worst dog sitting service, but it's also about so much else in this sort of terrible chaotic year. And I'm curious sort of what where did that idea come from to structure the essay in this way, and what were some of the tensions of this of having a kind of playful or experimental structure rather than the more, I don't know, straightforwardly lyrical structures of some of the other essays?
Yeah, they're completely different sorts of things. It took me a while to come to this structure. So I write a letter to this dog walking service, and it's a manic letter at a time when I was having daily migraines. I had just hit menopause, and turns out with menopause for me came daily migraines, and they never really went away. So you can take so many pills a month. And so it it chronicles my, I don't know, maybe it was a year, whatever that year was lost. I was an invalid, really. My effort to try to get through that time with the migraines and this really ferocious, mentally ill dog who was like 50 pounds and wanted to kill everybody and would throw herself against a window and terrify people on the street or attack other dogs. And I couldn't hold on to her. And because I was so tense and anxious, she was, of course, tense and anxious as well, and would, try to kill anyone who came near me. So I was trying to figure out how to do this. And I was very angry at this dog walking service because it kept switching people. And I thought, I can't handle the switching people. And you need something to be stable, and I was spending my whole day trying not to get a migraine. So if you have a headache, right, you take a little, you try to get rid of your headache. So imagine a migraine is that much worse and you're trying to get rid of your migraine, which means I walk around with, icing my head all day, trying not to get angry, because angry makes you have a migraine. And if someone new comes in and I need to take a nap, suddenly I can't take a nap. And if I go out with the dog and she's pulling too hard on the leash, it hurts my neck, and the pain in the neck gives you a migraine. So this became a manic time when I was also going to neurologists, and one neurologist gave me this one terrible drug called Topamax, which a lot of doctors call Dopamax because it makes you dumb. And so it has very severe cognitive, it's a very effective drug for a lot of different things, but it has such cognitive repercussions that they can't really use it. So I spent 3 months on this drug to try to get myself 3 days a month of no migraines, like not even 5% of a migraine. And during that time, I felt completely bonkers. And so I was very angry all the time and manic all the time. So I wrote this letter, desperate to try to figure out a way to structure whatever was happening to me. And at some point, instead of trying to put it in an essay, I thought, screw it, let me just write a letter to these bad people. And then eventually I realized that the letter was becoming a framework for something else, which was chronic pain. So it's really a story of chronic pain. So the experience of the dog walkers, and the dog walkers, and my hysteria, my trying to, I call some lady a cunt at some point, when I'm angry, and like I get completely nuts, but all of it is a pretty accurate description of what it's like to live with extreme chronic pain. And so I allowed the letter to just become this framework. And then I found I could do that with another letter, which was a letter to a turtle that I gave up while I was pregnant. It was my boyfriend's, sorry, you're smiling. So I gave up this turtle, it took me a long time to get to this form, to figure out the form properly. It's not like you can just attack the form, stick it in, and it works out, but it's really like a push and pull. And the form came later once I realized that I couldn't do it any other way, and it needed to be wild, and I needed to just do a stream of consciousness rant, essentially, and then start making sentence by sentence careful, accurate, precise, and effective. And so I had this very short letter to a turtle that was my boyfriend's turtle when I was pregnant. And then as I was revising the book, I thought, this isn't really working. We don't know anything about the turtle. All we know is that we got rid of the turtle. And so I started doing really, really deep research. And I do this in a lot of my essays, and it really helps structure the essay. So I did a lot of deep research on slider turtles, and apparently they're an invasive species, which I didn't know. And so we too added to that. In a Central Park turtle pond has a lot of turtles in it, and so that's where we put the turtle. So it went from just talking about leaving the turtle when my ex-husband got decided to have a new baby. So I was like, oh, you're having a new baby. And so then I started thinking about the turtle that we gave up at the beginning. This gets to belonging. At the beginning of our relationship, he moves in my apartment. I'm pregnant. And I decided at some point that I don't want the turtle and a baby. And I said, let's get rid of the turtle. And he's sick of cleaning it out. And it's a pain in the ass. Anyway, I do give this turtle the real backstory of its life. So we get rid of the turtle. And I think the turtle doesn't belong in my family, and I'm all excited to have a child. And then there's something really wrong with the child. It has Down syndrome, and I get rid of the child. And that child too didn't belong in my family. So there's a turn in this, and the letter becomes ostensibly about this long, beautiful life that this turtle have. Your mother loved you. You grew up in this farm with 500,000 other turtles. And the reason she left you is because that's what you're supposed to do, because they care for you. You had to learn how to be independent. Here are your first parents, your second parents. And I go into great detail about the turtle's life, because suddenly I care about the turtle again. And the turtle, I thought, I gave this turtle 20 years later, now that my son's 21, and I can't really introduce the turtle to my son. And I aborted the first one because the one thing we had decided, not knowing each other very well, we had known each other 3 months when I was pregnant. And my sister convinced me to have the baby. And I thought, great, okay, I'll just have this baby. And we agreed on not getting married and not not going through with the pregnancy if something was terribly wrong. And we didn't want to have a child that would have a very difficult life in this very difficult world, which is even more difficult. So the whole essay expanded and became this kind of love letter to the turtle. And I wanted to tell the turtle all about everything that had happened over the course of 20 years, including all the sadnesses and including the child I have, and which made me realize for the first time having to make a decision that I didn't want, which was to have an abortion, was the one thing that convinced me that I wanted a family, which I had never known. And I'm not sure that anyone really knows that people often get pregnant by accident, even though it's not so easy to get pregnant, apparently. But what did I know? And so it took me a long time to figure out that this was about belonging, and that in the end, the whole book is about belonging. So it is harsh in a way, but it's also kind of caring and compassionate, because I did care about that turtle, I guess, enough to write a letter to it. And I don't forget anything that happened. And I wonder in the letter about what really happened. So there's an iffy kind of memory moment, and there's a very real fact of what women have to go through when they get pregnant if they decide to abort. And then there's a very real moment of moments of having a turtle. If you're a child, you name it after yourself, and what the parents are. And then suddenly the parents move away, and the kid's like, why did you give my turtle away? I thought the turtle was part of our family. And for a kid, a turtle is always going to be part of the family. And so, you have all these ways of being in a family, and you have all these ways of belonging to a family. And right now, for me, the family is constantly evolving. So I'm actually much closer to my ex-husband than we were when we were married. So we started our friendship when we got divorced, and started arguing when we got divorced. We never really argued. And then we went through the full, end of the marriage syndrome after getting divorced, while trying to raise a very unruly, difficult child. So what, where do I belong? Do I belong in India and in Germany? Do I belong in this family and that family? I have a kind of fractured family, and most of us do. And now many more of us do than we would like, because of war and displacement. So now I've rambled for a while, but.
Thank you. No, this is perfect. This helps. I wanted to ask you about family earlier, but we've gone straight into we've got two questions in one, which is ideal. So I'll ask you. I've got two more questions I definitely want to ask you, and then I've got a few in reserve. But I want to talk to you about other writers, and particularly these sort of these quote unquote canonical texts, whatever that means, that you weave in through so much of this book. I've also read your essay on Dante. So you have this this wonderful, like, of all the things that get stuck in your cassette player, T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. You know, I would enjoy that for, you know, before it drove me insane. So you have this sort of meditation on four quartets being this sort of motif, unchosen motif in your life for a while. There's a extended meditation on Paradise Lost and Never Wrote Your Essays. And I know that you work a lot on Dante and on Divine Comedy. And I'd love to invite you to talk a little bit about how you kind of shape your writing when it is in response or in dialogue with another piece of writing that really moves you.
I have to say, this actually makes sense of my essays, doesn't it? Because you're thinking like, what do I write essays about? And inevitably, an epic poem works its way in, it's not contemporary work. I'm not so interested in that, but I am interested and I'm not religious. I don't believe in God. I'm interested in faith. I'm interested in the Garden of Eden. I'm interested in Satan and in cunning and strategy and the idea of falling. And if you look at poems, I like the way movement is vertical, falling and lifting at the same time. So you could have, like in Elizabeth Bishop's at the fish houses, there's a plank descending while something else is going up the stairs, or one wheelbarrow is going down, the plank that's ascending. So there's a lot of up and down moving that sort of connects to, I don't know, the misfortunes, a change of fortunes in epic poems. They really speak to me. Maybe that I'm a warmonger. I don't know, like the Iliad, I could just read over and over on a loop for the rest of my life and be like, go Achilles, and go, you know. And I love when Athena steps in, she gives him his excitement and his power, and he steps on the field, and everybody runs in terror, and he clears the field because he moves so fast and he's half God. So nothing excites me quite that way. And I think that they're connected to our lives in a way that a lot of literature isn't. So Paradise Lost, this whole Christian idea of sin and of falling, isn't really so much of a Christian idea. It could be a Jain idea, a Jewish idea. It could really be anything. It's about the idea of what kind of life do you want to live and what kind of choices do you make. So now I'm reading Dante on a loop forever. I'm reading the Commedia on a loop forever. And it's not really about sin. It's not the Christian poem I'm interested in. It's the idea of becoming, the same thing that my essay collection is supposed to do. Like, what is a process of becoming? What are you becoming? What are you turning into? What is transformation? So how do we transform as people? How do we do the incredibly hard and miserable work of looking into ourselves and saying, oh, that wasn't good enough? Or today we had I met my Dante group, and the canto in discussion was envy. And we were thinking about the ways in which we were envious and how envy varies from jealousy. And so one guy I'd listened to on a lecture had talked about, like, well, you know, I felt myself feeling envious at something or so and so. And I thought, oh, that's great that you thought that. I wouldn't have thought that. So I wouldn't have even characterized myself as envious. And he thought he had a long way to go. And I thought, obviously, I have farther to go, but I don't really care because we're just going to go on to the next cantos. But it's a conversation that you keep having. So my conversation with Paradise Lost, my conversation with Dante, who was having a conversation with Virgil, who lived 1,300 years before him, and who was having a conversation with us, just like Rembrandt is having a conversation with you when you go look at his self-portrait. So the idea of becoming is the idea of becoming relentless as an artist, but part of your relentlessness is understanding and valuing other artists. And that includes music, if you choose to do that, but it's whatever you care about. So if I'm going to, I ended up somehow accidentally caring about Dante, whereas I didn't care about him for most of my life. I had only read the Inferno a bunch of times in my 20s, and I didn't get too deeply into it. And then after COVID, during COVID, I started reading Purgatorio. And as a middle-aged person, Purgatorio and what that means, being in a state of in between and having to do penance, not that I think I need to do penance, but being in a place where you know you've done something wrong and you have to do penance for your sin in order to get to the next place. Well, I'm in the middle of getting to the next place. What is the next place? I want to be a better writer. Now I'm in total control, or semi, and not total control, but I'm in better control of my skills. So I know how to be a better writer, and I know what I can do, and I have a certain confidence. And then how to become a better writer, better person, do something unusual, and do the hard work of being inventive. And part of that is also being slow, decisive, aggressive, relentless. Like Dante did this work, he fictionalized himself in the poem as a state of becoming the poet that who would eventually be good enough to write the poem. So and he makes up a lot of stuff, and he really strategizes so that he can become the good guy, and he doesn't tell you anything. He lets everybody else, like in the Inferno, tell you their stories. So you dislike them, or you judge them, but you never judge him. But he's the one writing the story. So he's very cunning, and he's associated himself with Virgil, who he loves and who I think really helped him manage his exile from Florence. But he also is choosing Virgil, who was a great poet, the national poet of Rome. He's connecting classical Rome to his time now and saying the papacy, the Pope, oh, we've got a new Pope, is where it's all at. And now this is going to be the center of the world. Italy is going to be the center of the world. So he's doing a lot of things. I've never read someone as good as Dante on many levels that I will never get to the end of. I will never get to the end of Dante. I will read him all my life. I read him very casually right now for our second full reading. The third reading, we might go to something else and we'll look at, other texts. I'm excited that the new Pope is an Augustinian, because I think about, well, what is an Augustinian canto and what does that mean to Dante versus an Aristotelian canto? And I don't really understand Aristotle at all, except I think of him as rational. He's connected to Aquinas, and there's this way of combining things that's way beyond my pay level. But they all speak to me in a deeper, more meaningful, larger, bigger, arching kind of way than a lot of contemporary books. The state of publishing is, it depends. And as a poet, these great texts, matter a lot. That T.S. Eliot, the Four Quartets, I don't think there's quite anything that exists on that level that's that good. And the same with Paradise Lost. And I don't think that they can compare to Dante, who created the Italian language, who created literature. So it's not that I want to compare them. And but I don't think I've come across other things that hit me quite the way these things do, and that they become tropes in society too. So, and they're tropes for a reason, that they picked up on ideas, but they did great things. Like Milton was the smartest person in his time. He read everything, he understood everything. I can barely follow the prose or I haven't picked up the prose, the long treatises he did. But he changed the sentence, he changed the line. He did something really unusual to a line of poetry that nobody except Hopkins, Gerard Manley Hopkins, has done. And so before, people weren't in jamming, the line was pretty simple. Dante did the same thing. He changed the language to the vernacular. And as a writer, what could be greater than that? And the way he does things that are ambitious in Italian, are greedy and ambitious, and you must go there as a writer and try to be a bit proud so that you can get better, because if you don't try, then you're not going to get better. And but certainly Milton did things with enjambment and moving around the line, pushing against the end of the line in his blank verse, meaning not rhyming, that nobody else was capable of and no one else thought of, and hardly anyone can compete with that now. So there's a thrill, I guess.
You're making me want to reread Dante. I did try to, I had Purgatory. I also had a COVID Dante book club, but we, didn't get too far. But I'm inspired to revisit him. I'm half Italian, so do I wait till I get good enough to read in Italian, or just do it now?
Because you can follow along.
Exactly.
And plus, like we were saying today, like we're looking at, I had to email a Roman woman to try to figure out this one word, which she said was not ravaging, but something horrible. That different translators had rendered the response to rancor, was the word, to this moment of anger, as some in gray, with the color gray when talking about someone's face, and so everybody else had rendered it as a bright red face, and we were wondering how could they possibly render it so differently. And she said, no, it's rancor. Your face would be angry, purple, bruised. And so everybody's trying to get at it, and nobody can really get at it. Kind of like I'm trying to get at my story, but I can't get at the story, and nobody can really get at Dante. And even if you're reading in Italian, it's still medieval Italian, so you can't really get at it. And if you try to read it Paradiso in Italian, even if you speak Italian, you're still going to be lost. You're very lost. So, which is okay.
It's a tall order. So I do want to turn it over for the rest of the time we have, the next sort of 15 to 20 minutes or so, to our audience members. So if you do have questions, feel free to ask them or put them in the chat.
And I want to apologize for giving away the turtle story. I gave away the the ending, but you're going to learn a lot about turtles.
So I love what you were saying just now about Dante, about Milton, about Virgil, and that seems to fit quite nicely into this whole theme of belonging, and it being so important for Dante to connect himself back to I guess his own literary idol, to connect back to connect back into this tradition. Well, not even to a tradition, to one writer who he's picked out as being the great epic writer who he wants to join. And I'm wondering how that plays out for you. Like I think you talked about your mother not having been able to be a writer, and like what is the connection for you in your writing, in your identity as a writer? Where do you belong there?
Are you asking about who I connect to as a writer? Besides Dante, or can you?
Well, who you connect to, but also how you connect to. Like, is the way that you connect to let's say Dante, for example, is the way that you connect to Dante similar or different from the way that you connect to your family?
Wow, that's a really bold, aggressive question. It's a wonderful question. I wish I could say yes. I think it's much easier to connect to a dead writer who's a genius and who you'll never understand. Although I'm listening to myself talk, I was about to say then a parent, but of course you'll never understand your parents either. And I have one parent who's dead and one who's alive, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of them. And I have a lot of record keeping. My mother didn't keep anything. She threw everything out. So my sister and I would never know much. And we have just 50 pages of her letters when she was 18 and going to Europe for the first time. And she was clearly a brilliant writer. As for my father, it's not that I connect to him, don't connect to him. Maybe I can revise my moral stance on this, my ethics. It's so much more, I feel that in a way that Dante is more understandable. Like I'll never get to the end of Dante, but I will get to the bottom of Dante. I will never get to the bottom of my father. I will never understand really what motivates him and why he is the way he is. Like at some point recently, he wrote me this very desperate, sad, fearful apology for something he said that I had called back. I called him back and I said, that made me very upset. And for the first time in his life, he sent this very genuine apology. And I was like, oh, I never expected to get anything this moving in my life from him, but he was able to do it on email, never in person. If you say something like when I got divorced and I said, Dad, I'm getting divorced, his face is like, and Dad, this, this happened. Nothing, like just zero. I mean, that's what Indian Jains are like. I think they're all like that. And there's a way of having life wash off you. So I can't connect to my family in the same way I connect to other dead writers who will welcome me in. So I know, I was going to say, I know that Dante loves me, but I kind of do. Like, he loved Virgil, and he set up Virgil for us to love instead of Beatrice, because it's Virgil he really cares about. And he clearly anticipated his audience and his greatness and understood that people would be reading him later. So I believe that we are in a relationship, in a conversation, just like he was in a conversation with Virgil. But my therapist says that she's in a conversation with Rembrandt, because she goes to look at his self-portrait and she thinks that he designed that self-portrait, looking at us over time, knowing that he would be great, knowing that people would look at him in a particular way, and designed his portrait for people to understand something about. So you can do that. And it's kind of shocking, actually. It just opened my mind, because I realized, oh, what if I do that? What if one part of something that I do lasts a little, and someone is able to connect to me? So I'm always looking to other people in the past to connect to, because maybe they're substitutes, maybe they're easier to connect to than family, but it's also like, it's important to connect over time. And there's something about archives that I'm interested in. And, I'm trying to kind of create an archive with my dad by asking him a million questions all the time. And then he answers, he's 92, in perfect, lucid, incredible detail at length. And so it doesn't give you the emotion of the relationship, but one day when he is gone, I will have those moments, and I can kind of drum up something, and he will still be gone, and I'm fooling myself thinking that somehow those will suffice, or they will help, but I can make something of it. And if I make something of it, then I'm back into writing, and then writing gives me the nourishment of the family that isn't there and maybe never nourished me in the first place. And then I go back and read Paradise Lost and Dante, I guess.
Thanks.
Yeah.
It's kind of beautifully, I don't know, almost backwards, that you can have this, in a way, very easy relationship with a writer who's been dead for 500 years, but it makes sense because he, because his art is communicating, and obviously communicating part of himself, but part of the way he sees the world, in a way that most of us aren't able to reach that level
Right.
of expression.
Yeah, same with Beethoven, right? So we're catching up. So when I'm listening to him, I'll start listening. Okay, well, a musician will listen better than me, but I can start hearing the layers and the resolution or the lack of resolution, and the same thing with Dante. So if I did try mapping out one canto once for a friend, and I thought, okay, well, here, just off the top of my head, 15 different things that he's doing psychologically, theologically, idiomatically, rhetorically in this particular canto. And he does that in everything. And I think I will never be able to do something like that, but I can try to get closer to it and try. So there's no end. But yeah, we're all catching up.
Benjamin, I see you have your mic off. Does that mean you have
Yes, I do. I have like many different thoughts about all this. Like I wrote down a lot of it so I didn't forget. My memory can be a little haphazard like that, and like situational. But in any case, I wanted to just start out, like, first of all, like with the Beethoven story. That's, well, like, it's like Beethoven is a deaf man speaking, when, like, he shouldn't be able to hear, like, he can't hear what he says, but like everyone else can hear it, and it's right. Like, there's something right about it, and there's something that like transcends like space and time there, in that your mother can connect to that music, and then you can connect to it, and it forms like a sort of synergy connection. So like Beethoven, I guess it's like he's a deaf man speaking, and so maybe like for your mother, I'm getting the impression that maybe she was listening to that, like thinking that, well, like maybe she wasn't being heard in some way but like what would that sound like if like she could hear like herself or see herself like from like an outsider's perspective, because we often like we make meaning, but we don't see it like we don't see it like as it is always, so we're biased inherently. But I mean, I'm thinking of like your passage. You said you haven't heard of your, or you haven't heard your mother in like 20 years, but I mean, I heard her like just now through your writing. So I'd like to thank you for that. Like it's like being a speaker for the dead. And I mean, I think that's just what many cultural traditions, it's imperative that we do that, because I mean, history is just, it's replete with experience and meaning. And like if we forget that, well, we like let our ancestors down in the, and not like they're here to like punish us like physically, but just in the sense that, well, they learned these lessons, they strove to get as far as they did, and maybe they made mistakes along the way, but like we're here to appreciate like what they did and like live the benefits of them. So it's like this never ending process. Like the meaning you make, like it's something that you always make until your last breath. And there's like you said, like you alluded to and said explicitly repeatedly, there's no like there's no one answer to everything. You know, there's no like, we'd just be on autopilot our whole lives if there were one answer. Like there wouldn't be any like choice, any agency to it. And even plays where, you know, they're pre-written, we ascribe agency to them. So it's like in choosing to appreciate the nuances of like human emotion and like the historicity around your like family and the famous writers of like the ancients. You're, what was I going to say? I was just going to say that like in appreciating all these things, you're transcending. It's like you're in the present moment, but you're just letting things like pass through you. You're being like a conduit, but you're like directing it. So it's like this hybridization. Like you can't go from like you can't be like the most general or the most specific. Like you can keep going down like past the atom to the subatomic particles and on, but you're not going to be able to see the smallest possible thing. You know, like there isn't a measurement for that, and there isn't a measurement for the largest possible thing either. There's just a measurement, or, well, not a measurement, it's just like part of it is like a sense experience. And yeah, it's just you affirm yourself by being in line with your authentic self. I guess that's my impression from like hearing you share your writings, is that like you're expressing yourself in a way that you didn't feel you could before. And you know, speaking for your mother too. And that's like what I strive to do with like just whatever I write. It literally is stream of consciousness thought. Like I don't want to feel like it has to be perfect. I just want to write it down, whatever the hell it is, and have it exist, like have it be acknowledged. So I guess my question, I mean, I was just wanting to share a lot of these thoughts, and I appreciate you all being patient with that monologue. But like, when did you decide, or like, how did you decide um, to write, or was it a decision versus just you just got the urge, you felt like it was right, and you picked up the pen and started to write?
Oh, you know, probably just like you. So you can't, you feel the need to write. Well, I you know, my memory's iffy, but I wrote because I was so lonely when people were so racist and bigoted in New Jersey. So my memory of beginning to write was probably around 8 or 10, and I had no friends, and my parents were very unhappy, and my mother was too depressed to leave her room. So I really had very little in my mind after coming here from India, where you have this giant Indian endless family, giant secular party everywhere all the time. And it's very warm. And I don't remember my parents really being around in India. You have a million aunts and cousins, and they take care of you. You grow up with them. So coming to America was sad. I mean, it was happy. Everybody's like, "You're going to America. That's the best thing you could do in India." But coming here immediately, there was enough racism that at some point I wasn't great at school. I was good at literature only. I didn't care about school. I was good at sports, and maybe I was good at desire at some point. But I really I wrote Revelations style poems out of kind of a frustrated anger that bubbled out of me. And clearly I was a poet. Clearly I was going to be a writer. And I didn't know that I was writing poems. I mean, they were all just fire and brimstone and rage. And I was always by myself. So I had a big book called The Nothing Book, and I had all these different colorful pages, and I wrote in them. And at some point, I figured out that they were poems, and I figured out that I liked my English classes, and I eventually tried to pay attention in the other classes. But over time, I never, what's interesting about this, about writing, and, I have a prose book now, and I have a novel coming out that I didn't intend to write a novel, but it just sort of happened because one day I got fired from a job, and it was right in the middle of my divorce, and the people felt bad for me because they shouldn't have fired me. And they gave me, I was making a ton of money. So I had like 8 months at $100,000. And so I started writing. I thought, I'm not going to work. I'm just going to stay here. And I was too depressed to do anything else anyway. My husband had left me. I got fired from my job. Life really sucked, but I can write something. And now that was 14 years ago. And now I have a novel. And where was I going with this? I never thought that I would do anything besides write poetry. So of course, I have a physician father, and he said, "Do you want to be a physician?" I said, "No, thank you." "Would you like to be a lawyer?" "I'll pay for that." And I said, "No, thank you." "Are you sure you don't want to be a physician? How about an economist?" "I'll pay for that." "No, thank you." "No, I'd like to be a poet. Can you give me $5,000 after, I got a fellowship for grad school?" "Nope, you're on your own." And all my life, I really had no other interests. I couldn't figure out anything else that I cared about at all. Really, I just didn't. And as a young poet in my 20s, I remember talking to someone else who was a photographer and interested in making music. And I was like aghast that he wanted to do other things than just write poems. And he's like, "What, you think I'm betraying this?" And I said, "Yes, yeah, you should be writing poems." And I made my life as an editor and journalist. And then eventually, at one point, when I was frustrated at something, and I ended up writing an essay about not being able to read anything but Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain, The Magic Mountain. And then that was the first essay I wrote. And I did not know that my mind was actually kind of a perfect mind for what the essay should do. And sometimes you follow a thread and you pick it up or you leave it. And there are different ways of doing essays and interrogating in them. Like James Baldwin is a very interrogative writer. And so maybe I that has influenced me most. But I think what you're talking about, like what you just said, is it Ben or Benjamin? Benjamin?
Oh,
So
Benjamin.
Benjamin. So what you just said about like wanting to write and feeling that need to just write it down and not necessarily care how it comes out. Well, that is what writing is, right? And we all think it's supposed to be more polished. And everybody complains like, "Oh, I don't have." It turns out nobody is good at structure. Everyone says, "Oh, this person must be really good at structure." It turns out really nobody is. You just have to kind of relentlessly edit, just like you have to relentlessly be, figure it out. And I thought, well, I'm a poet. That's why I'm not good at a novel structure, and I'm not good at an essay structure. It turns out, everybody sucks at this. And
It's funny that you mentioned poetry, because I was just thinking, like, most of this conversation, how like poetry is just, it just feels like, and I'm saying this as someone who, like, I mean, the way school taught poetry, I really had disliked it, but then I've like written over like 100 poems. I haven't like published them. I just got like this itch to write them, because it was like this way to not have to write according to like a certain style, or like according to like
yeah,
like
great.
prose, just to make it like a little, not to like intentionally confuse people, but it's like it allows you to be like neologic and creative throughout. And that's like very liberating, like not having to have it be this particular way. Like it just is what it is, you know. And I can say things that are irreverent and witty, without like really in. It's like not. It's not that. Like I swear, when I write these things, I intend to write one thing, and then it becomes like something else entirely, or something just much larger than I would have imagined. And I think that's just like how the writing or like creative process and processes in general work. Like it's not, you don't have it all like fully formed out. Yeah, it's not like it's not like Athena spraying out of Zeus's head fully formed. That's not how it works. It's just you put it out there. Like it's through
and then you
the
have it to
striving.
play with, and you think, well, what do I want to do with this? But that is what it is. Like that is what writing is. We like to think it's something much more complicated and organized, but really it's like a feeling,
Yeah, it's like a feeling when you're lost, to be found, or to put something out there so it is found. Like, because I'm in this like a sort of period where I feel lost, and I'm trying to find like not just inspiration, but just just do something that's right, like that's in line with my authentic self. Because I think that's what it is at the end of the day. It's not like how much money you have, or like how much of anything. It's it is like the quality of your life. It's like, do you keep going when it like sucks? Because like there are all these reasons to just stop, but then you don't know why you're not stopping, so you're going anyway. But that's where it's just writing or saying what's there, doing something, even if like other people aren't gonna like it, or
well, then you're belonging to your words, or your words belong to you, right? So like there's something about actually getting beyond like even belonging to a writer who's dead or another writer who's alive and you care about, but you're belonging to yourself, but you're belonging to your words that you're actually playing with, that you're, and these words exist somewhere in the universe and you're combining them. So you don't even, there's something, and I think Dante thought this. He thought, well, I don't belong to I don't know if I even belong to Italy. I don't belong to Florence anymore. I don't belong to this, but I do belong in this poem. My legacy is this poem. So I live in this poem, and how I will be remembered is not in a place, but in this poem. And perhaps many writers think this way, and maybe musicians and artists think this way too. Like you leave yourself in your work, but in the process, I mean, yes, you're there, but really the place that you exist, that you belong, is in creating the work while you're writing it. And then once it's done, it's gone, but you still belong in it, so you can go back to it. Because I just wanted to bring it back. I'm just trying to do the
There's also just something to be said about like with belonging. Like you have to, like when someone else says, well, this word like belongs to me, or you can only use this word in a particular way. Like I'm not one who like believes in like policing language. It's just, I think if you use it with like, you connote it with like the right meaning, the right like well, like good intentions. And I mean, I know what the saying is about that, but you know what I mean, like the right atmosphere. Because I mean, you can use like those hateful words you mentioned, and it makes like it has a place here, right? But if someone uses them to demean someone, like that's like an atrocious thing to do. But then it's not bad in every case. So you shouldn't just completely ban the words, because in certain instances, because there's a historicity to it, it has to be. It just has to be said, because if you don't say something, then like does it exist to some people in a certain respect? Like that, I think that's what writing, or just the art is in general. It's saying what needs to be said, even if people don't like it.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. Yeah, so I'm very sorry, but I do have to, I do have to sort of
Right,
wrap
you got to
up.
catch your
You're
ferry.
policing
It is the last ferry, or I'll miss it. But I just want to say thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you, Anne, for being here. Thank you, Dan and Benjamin, for your insightful questions and comments and thoughts. I've put a link to Diane's book in the chat, so if you have not already bought Happier Far, I highly recommend you do so. Thank you all so much for an incredible conversation. And Diane, stay in touch. And everyone, enjoy the rest of your night.
Thank you for coming and for your wonderful questions.
No, it was a real pleasure. And I have to go reread some Dante.
Okay. Okay.
Have a great rest of your night, everybody.